Neil deGrasse Tyson has a way of asking questions that feel deceptively simple until you notice the ground moving beneath your feet. He won't shout or preach or threaten eternal consequences. He just places a quiet question on the table and watches it rearrange the furniture in your mind. That's why his comments about Christianity unsettle people, not because they're cruel, but because they're calm. When someone calmly asks why an all-powerful creator would design a universe where most planets are barren wastelands and most species die off before they can blink, the drama writes itself. There's something oddly refreshing about a person who treats curiosity as a normal human reflex rather than a dangerous impulse. Tyson doesn't attack anyone's identity. He just points out that if a carpenter built a house with this many design flaws, no homeowner would accept mysterious ways as an excuse. And there's the tension, the human tendency to forgive divine architecture what we would never forgive in a contractor. What makes his perspective sting is that it approaches Christianity not through anger or rebellion, but through a basic expectation of coherence. If you're going to say the universe was crafted with care, the craftsmanship should look intentional rather than improvised. Yet when you zoom out far enough, the cosmos resembles a place that couldn't care less about us. Most of it is either freezing, burning, empty, collapsing, or exploding. If this is hospitality, it's the kind where the host forgets you're coming and the house burns down while you're knocking on the door. People often complain that this view sounds cold, but Tyson's whole point is that honesty shouldn't be mistaken for cynicism. If anything, he's challenging cynicism by suggesting that reality deserves to be understood rather than decorated. Christianity, however, has built an entire emotional economy around the opposite idea, that comfort is more important than clarity. The universe might be confusing, but as long as you can picture a kindly cosmic caretaker watching over you, the ambiguity feels less intimidating. There's a certain psychological tenderness in that, but also a problem. When someone grows up hearing that every coincidence is a sign, every setback a test, every joy a blessing, the world starts to feel like a theater where everything has a script. Tyson disrupts that by asking whether the script exists at all, or whether humans just can't tolerate a stage without a playwright. It's remarkable how quickly people get defensive when the narrator steps off the page and leaves them alone with their own thoughts. What bothers some Christians is not the content of Tyson's questions, but their implications. If a belief collapses the moment someone asks why a benevolent designer would hide fossils in sedimentary layers older than the supposed age of Earth, the belief wasn't built to last. And if a moral system depends on the threat of punishment rather than the cultivation of empathy, it's not a moral system. It's a behavioral leash dressed up in poetic language. This is where the tension between scientific thinking and religious tradition becomes impossible to ignore. Christianity, at least in its institutional form, relies heavily on certainty. Certainty is the anchor, the shield, the comforting blanket. Tyson comes along and says, certainty is the fastest way to stop learning, and suddenly the room gets uncomfortable. People don't like hearing that their anchor might also be their prison. Yet it's not personal. He's not trying to rip comfort away from anyone. He's simply reminding people that comfort is not the same as truth. They can coexist, but they don't guarantee each other. And when someone defends a fragile idea with passion, it's rarely the idea they're protecting. It's the emotional scaffolding holding their worldview together. There's an old habit in Christian thinking that treats questions as suspicious. Doubt is framed as a spiritual virus that must be contained before it spreads. But Tyson treats doubt as the immune system of the mind. If your beliefs can't withstand a question, maybe the belief is the virus, not the cure. Some people try to counter him with, but what if the universe was designed specifically for us? The irony writes itself. If the universe were designed for us, it would be less likely to kill us for stepping outside without sunscreen. It would have more breathable atmospheres, fewer catastrophic asteroids, and perhaps a slightly more generous ratio of hospitable planets. Designing a universe for humans by filling it with lethal physics is like designing a playground for children and filling it with open manholes. And yet, the idea persists because it feels good. Humans like stories where they are the main character. Christianity provides that in abundance. Purpose, destiny, cosmic importance. Tyson does the opposite. He offers perspective. He reminds us that Earth is a pale speck orbiting a star that will eventually die, in a galaxy drifting through a universe that isn't obligated to notice us. Some find that terrifying, others find it liberating. But either way, it's at least honest. This honesty makes Christianity feel small, not out of disrespect, but because the universe is not obligated to shrink itself to fit our comfort. When Tyson describes the cosmos, the language isn't hostile, it's humbling, and humility has always been a dangerous solvent for religious certainty. Once you stop imagining yourself at the center, the entire architecture of divine narratives begins to wobble. The universe stops looking like a personal message and starts looking like a grand, indifferent orchestra playing its own music. The irony is that many Christians admire Tyson when he talks about nebulae, black holes, and stellar evolution, but the moment he applies the same reasoning to their beliefs, he suddenly becomes arrogant. It's a curious double standard. Intelligence is appreciated until it wanders into forbidden rooms. The deeper issue is that Christianity thrives on emotional dependency, not necessarily on God, but on the idea of being watched, guided, protected. Remove that surveillance, and people suddenly have to explain their own decisions without appealing to invisible approval. Some find that empowering, others find it terrifying. Tyson simply exposes this psychological attachment by asking questions that break the illusion gently but firmly. And this is where the conversation gets interesting. There's a particular moment that tends to irritate defenders of Christian doctrine. The moment Tyson points out that the universe behaves with perfect consistency whether anyone prays or not. A star expands, collapses, explodes, a tectonic plate shifts, a virus mutates. None of these events pause to ask whether someone nearby has recited the right words. If the universe were governed by selective intervention, you'd expect at least a hint of preferential physics sprinkled around places with high church attendance. But the cosmos remains beautifully indifferent. This indifference feels offensive only if you've been taught that reality is supposed to cater to you. Without that expectation, the universe's neutrality becomes a kind of honesty, an open invitation to understand it without begging for permission. Tyson's style of thinking leans hard in that direction. Stop assuming the cosmos owes you an explanation and start observing what it actually does. Some Christians object by saying that the absence of intervention is actually proof of divine restraint, which is one of those arguments that folds in on itself like a paper crane made of fog. If intervention would be too obvious and non-intervention is also meaningful, then every possible event becomes evidence, which means nothing is evidence at all. Tyson has an unspoken rule: if your explanation works even when nothing happens, it's not an explanation. There's something almost poetic about watching his questions peel away the layers of inherited certainty. It's not violent, it's methodical, like untangling a knot that's been tightened for centuries by repetition. A belief becomes habitual, the habit becomes identity, and identity becomes something you defend even when you no longer remember why you started believing it in the first place. Tyson isn't attacking the person, he's addressing the knot. Some people mistake the tension of untangling for aggression. Another idea he often hints at without saying it outright is that Christianity tends to treat human ignorance as a spiritual opportunity. When people don't understand lightning, they call it divine anger. When they can't explain disease, they call it divine punishment. When they can't explain consciousness, they call it divine breath. Tyson walks into that room of unexamined assumptions and simply says, maybe not. That's it. 2 words. And somehow those 2 words are enough to make entire institutions bristle. There's a fascinating psychological mechanism at play here. Humans hate uncertainty, so when they encounter gaps in knowledge, they rush to fill them. Christianity historically fills the gaps with divine intention. Science fills them with further questions. Tyson's method is the latter. Don't rush. Don't claim victory. Don't pretend to know. Just keep asking. That approach sounds harmless until you realize how deeply some people rely on the illusion of already having the answer. This leads to one of the most uncomfortable points Tyson raises, not through accusation but through implication. If a belief system teaches that asking the wrong question is dangerous, then the belief system is afraid of its own foundations. Strong ideas don't need protection, fragile ones do. When Tyson asks why a perfect creator would design humans with a blind spot where the optic nerve enters the retina, he's not nitpicking, he's offering a stress test. And the moment the explanation collapses into, well, we're not meant to understand, you can practically hear the alarm bells ringing. These little fractures reveal a larger pattern. Christianity often uses certainty as insulation. It creates a narrative so emotionally rewarding that questioning it feels like betrayal, not of the idea, but of your community, your childhood, your family, your sense of belonging. Tyson understands this, which is why his tone stays calm. When someone's defenses are built from the soft material of nostalgia and fear, the worst thing you can do is attack with force. He uses gentleness like a scalpel. Consider the way Christians often describe hardship as part of a divine plan. The intent is comforting, but the logic is a maze. If something wonderful happens, it's a blessing. If something terrible happens, it's a test. If something random happens, it's a mystery. This elasticity might be emotionally helpful, but it's intellectually empty. Tyson likes systems that don't have to change shape every time reality shifts. Predictability isn't just convenient, it's a form of respect. A universe that behaves consistently is a universe you can learn from. And learning is what threatens religious explanations the most. Not because knowledge is hostile, but because it replaces the need for magical answers. Every time science explains a phenomenon Christianity once claimed as divine territory, a small portion of spiritual authority dissolves. Lightning, earthquakes, plagues, solar eclipses. Each new discovery shrinks the domain of supernatural interpretation, and Tyson's work accelerates that shrinkage simply by pointing out the obvious. Knowledge grows, and the divine retreat that follows is not a coincidence. What bothers Christian apologists is not the expansion of knowledge itself, but the exposure of the mechanism behind their explanations. If a belief only thrives in the absence of understanding, then its survival depends on ignorance. Tyson reveals this unintentionally. His questions illuminate dark corners that religious narratives prefer to leave unexamined. When a single inquiry can unravel an entire doctrine, the doctrine was woven from flimsy thread. Yet he never gloats. He doesn't need to. The unraveling speaks for itself. People sometimes accuse him of arrogance simply for saying, "I don't know," followed by, "Let's find out." It's a strange world where humility is mistaken for pride and blind certainty is celebrated as virtue. Tyson's attitude, the willingness to admit ignorance, is treated by some as a threat because once you acknowledge you don't know, you open the door to the possibility that the answers you were handed might be wrong. And that's the true source of discomfort. The recognition that belief isn't protected by truth, but by repetition. Break the repetition, and the belief starts to wobble. What makes this wobble particularly revealing is how quickly it turns defensive. Mention the age of the universe, and watch someone explain why a book written 2,000 years ago somehow has more accurate cosmology than every telescope ever built. Mention evolution, and hear the acrobatics required to argue that fossils were planted as tests of faith. Mention the scale of the galaxy, and observe the insistence that out of countless worlds, this particular blue dot is somehow the sole stage for divine drama. The defensive tone doesn't indicate strength, it indicates fear, the fear that the story won't survive, compare and contrast with the observable world. Tyson has no interest in comforting that fear. His interest lies in the world itself, in the patterns it reveals, in the humility it demands. And that humility stands in quiet, steady contrast with the loud, reassuring certainty offered by religion. The contrast becomes glaring the moment you realize that Christianity often promises answers before the questions are even asked. Tyson offers questions long before answers appear. It's a different rhythm, a different posture, a different relationship with the unknown. Christianity treats uncertainty as a threat. Tyson treats it as a horizon. The horizon keeps expanding. One of the subtler themes in Tyson's commentary is the way Christianity imagines itself at the center of everything, even when the evidence points in every direction except inward. There's an almost endearing confidence in assuming that the entire cosmic narrative revolves around a single species on a single planet, orbiting a single star in a galaxy that's one spiral among hundreds of billions. Tyson doesn't mock the sentiment. He simply highlights its scale. The universe is vast enough to make ego feel embarrassed. That embarrassment is often misinterpreted as hostility, but the embarrassment is healthy. It's the mind recognizing that it has been living in a room with the curtains drawn and finally stepping outside. Christianity, particularly in the way it teaches cosmic significance, prefers the curtains closed. The world feels safer when the sun isn't so bright. Tyson opens them slowly, not to shame anyone, but to show that daylight is not the enemy. This tension becomes most visible in conversations about creation. Christianity frames creation as an act of intention, a divine artist shaping a universe with human beings as the intended audience. Tyson looks at the same universe and sees no trace of that priority. Stars form through gravitational collapse. Planets accrete from dust. Species evolve through natural selection. The universe operates elegantly, without any hint of stage direction. Some defenders of Christianity respond by saying that divine intention is simply hidden, but when the explanation for intention is invisibility, your argument has slipped quietly into the realm of unfalsifiable comfort. Tyson prefers explanations that become clearer the more closely you examine them, not ones that require you to look away. And this is where the contrast becomes intellectual rather than emotional. Christianity often asks people to accept explanations first and seek understanding second. Tyson flips that order. The explanation should emerge from the evidence, not the other way around. This inversion feels threatening only to those who rely on inherited narratives rather than observed reality. Take the story of humanity's special status. Christianity insists that humans were crafted in a unique moral and spiritual image. Tyson, however, points out that our biology is a patchwork of evolutionary improvisations, a spine not optimized for bipedalism, sinuses that drain upward, and a reproductive system that would be considered hilariously inefficient if it weren't so vital. These are not the hallmarks of perfect design. They're the fingerprints of natural processes that work well enough to persist, but not well enough to avoid criticism. Yet pointing this out is often treated as irreverent. But why should pointing out the universe's actual behavior be considered impolite? Tyson isn't judging, he's observing, and observation is only threatening to ideas that cannot survive being seen clearly. A particularly revealing example is the Christian explanation for suffering. Suffering, depending on who you ask, is either punishment, refinement, divine silence, or simply part of a grand plan too complex for human minds. Tyson doesn't buy any of those narratives, not because he's cold, but because he refuses to assign moral intention to indifferent phenomena. A newborn with a congenital disorder does not need a theological backstory. The universe is not personalizing tragedy. Gravity isn't punishing anyone. Biology isn't sending coded messages. The insistence that suffering must be meaningful says more about human discomfort than about cosmic design. People crave narrative coherence. Christianity offers it, even when the explanation contradicts itself. Tyson refuses it, even when the refusal leaves emotional gaps. One path offers comfort, the other offers truth-seeking. Neither is inherently cruel, but only one prioritizes honesty over consolation. There is also the curious way Christianity handles disagreement. Some believers insist that questioning doctrine is noble, even encouraged, but only to a certain point. Cross that invisible boundary and you're told the questions are no longer constructive, which is usually code for "they make us uncomfortable." Tyson's presence in the cultural conversation pushes people toward that boundary, not by attacking them, but by asking what exactly lies beyond the line they refuse to cross. A belief system that must shelter itself from inquiry is not protecting people, it's protecting itself. Tyson implicitly exposes this by treating questions as neutral tools. He is not trying to corner anyone, he's trying to understand why certain ideas need to be immune from scrutiny at all. Consider the way Christianity explains human behavior. Desires become temptations, mistakes become sins, complex psychological mechanisms become moral narratives. Tyson doesn't replace these narratives with cruelty, he replaces them with curiosity. Why do brains behave this way? Why do humans gravitate towards certain patterns? Why do societies create moral codes? These are questions that open doors, not close them. Christianity often prefers the doors closed, citing divine authority as the lock. The funniest irony, though humorous in a very dry, cosmic sense, is that Christianity credits a perfect being with creating a species that must constantly apologize for being what it is. Tyson never says this directly, but the implication is almost comedic. If humans are flawed, perhaps the blueprint wasn't written by an architect with infinite competence. Maybe the blueprint wasn't written by anyone at all. Even this suggestion is seen as dangerous, not because it's cruel, but because it shifts the narrative from blame to understanding. Christians often say humans are broken. Tyson says humans are complicated. One perspective encourages guilt, the other encourages exploration. As Tyson often hints, guilt isn't a scientific category, it's a moral invention, an emotional leash, a psychological tool. When a belief system teaches you to feel perpetually unworthy so that you remain dependent on its solutions, that dependency becomes a form of quiet control. Tyson exposes this not through accusation, but by removing the need for the leash entirely. And then there's the cultural dimension, the way Christianity frames doubt as a threat to community cohesion. When someone begins to think differently, they're often met with disappointment, disguised as concern. You're losing your way, they're told, or you used to believe, as if belief were an anchor left behind rather than a pair of heavy boots finally removed. Tyson represents the permission to remove the boots. He represents the idea that knowledge expands more beautifully when it isn't constrained by fear. He represents a worldview where questions are not threats, but invitations. And that simple equation, questions over certainty, is precisely what destabilizes religious conviction. What makes this destabilization fascinating is that it doesn't require confrontation. It requires honesty. The moment a person stops forcing themselves to accept answers that feel borrowed, the whole framework starts to shift. Tyson's influence lies in making people aware of that moment, not by telling them what to think, but by showing them what the universe looks like when you stop insisting it revolves around your personal story. This quiet redirection can feel like betrayal to those who cling to the narrative of divine importance. But betrayal is the wrong word. It's growth. It's the mind evolving past the stories it inherited. And Christianity, for all its historical power, has never been comfortable with the idea that inherited stories might not age well. There's a certain elegance in the way Tyson dismantles religious certainty without ever declaring war on it. He treats beliefs the way a physicist treats a hypothesis, something to be tested, not something to be cherished for its emotional value. Christianity, however, often treats its claims as untouchable heirlooms, objects polished, defended, and protected from the natural wear of scrutiny. Tyson doesn't swing a hammer at the glass cabinet. He simply opens it, and the startling fragility of those heirlooms becomes apparent on its own. Consider the Christian narrative of divine communication, the idea that the creator of galaxies chooses to speak through burning shrubs, ancient shepherds, and a handful of prophets in the Middle East, has always stretched the limits of credibility. Tyson never mocks the notion overtly. He simply raises an eyebrow, in a figurative sense, and asks why a being with omnipotent abilities communicates with all the subtlety of an unreliable narrator. If clarity were the goal, the stars themselves could have carried the message. Instead, we're left with interpretations, translations, and centuries of theological infighting over which metaphor was meant to be literal. This is not malice, it's observation. And observation is often the sharpest form of critique. The Christian response tends to appeal to mystery. God works in ways beyond our understanding. But the moment mystery becomes a shield, it stops being profound and starts being evasive. Tyson's perspective implicitly challenges this reflex. Mystery should invite exploration, not obedience. The universe is overflowing with unanswered questions: black holes, quantum phenomena, the nature of consciousness. None of these require sacred disclaimers. They stand proudly in their uncertainty, inviting investigation. Christianity's mysteries, by contrast, often serve to end the conversation rather than begin it. This evasiveness becomes especially visible when discussing scriptures. Tyson points out with clinical neutrality that ancient texts reflect the worldview, limitations, and misconceptions of the people who wrote them, suggesting that a book composed in a prescientific era contains the final word on cosmology, biology, and morality feels almost theatrical in its implausibility. Yet many Christians insist that divine perfection guided the hands of the authors. Tyson doesn't need to argue. He simply notes the contradictions. The universe behaves consistently. The texts do not. One source invites replication and verification. The other demands acceptance on authority. The conflict resolves itself. There's also the matter of historical development. Christianity didn't simply appear. It evolved. Doctrines were added, removed, modified, debated, councils met, decisions were made, heresies declared. Tyson doesn't bring these details up to score points, but the implication is impossible to miss. If truth is eternal and divinely revealed, why does it require committees to define it? Why does salvation hinge on the outcome of meetings held by men who argued passionately about metaphysics, while living in an era when most people didn't know where the sun went at night? This is where dry humor becomes a sharpened tool. Tyson's tone often carries a soft, unspoken question. If the cosmos were designed with intentionality, why does the story of that intention read like the minutes of a political convention? Christian apologists tend to respond with elaborate theological frameworks, layers upon layers of explanation meant to reconcile historical messiness with divine perfection. Tyson doesn't bother dismantling these structures directly. He simply points to the scale of the universe. The sheer immensity of it makes human narratives feel quaint, almost accidental. The idea that an all-powerful creator fine-tuned billions of galaxies only to become preoccupied with the dietary habits of ancient tribes is the kind of absurdity that collapses under the weight of perspective alone. But perspective is precisely what Christianity often discourages. The faith emphasizes intimacy, a personal relationship, a personal savior, a personal plan. The world becomes a tailored experience. There's comfort in that, but also a subtle distortion. Tyson's cosmic view strips away that personalization. It replaces the script with a panorama so vast that human ego dissolves into something more honest, smaller, but freer. This freedom can feel unsettling. Without the divine script, people suddenly face a world where meaning is not pre-assigned. Christianity offers pre-written meaning as a kind of existential shortcut. Tyson offers the possibility that meaning is something we construct through curiosity, connection, creativity. One option is ready-made, the other requires effort. The appeal of ready-made answers is obvious. Another area where Tyson's critique lands quietly but firmly is morality. Christianity teaches that moral law is absolute, originating from a perfect authority. Yet the moral instructions in Scripture reflect the ethics of the societies that produced them, societies comfortable with slavery, patriarchal dominance, and divine retribution. Tyson doesn't turn morality into a battlefield. Instead, he asks the implicit question: why would a timeless moral code look suspiciously like the cultural norms of ancient civilizations? If morality were divinely delivered, you'd expect it to transcend the biases of the time. Instead, we see moral progress arising not from revelation, but from human reflection. We reject old cruelty not because God updated his instructions, but because humans expanded their empathy. Tyson's perspective aligns with that pattern. We become better when we understand more, not when we cling to inherited rules. This raises a deeper discomfort, the recognition that moral authority might not come from above at all, that morality might be a social and psychological construction, refined through experience and reason. For those accustomed to outsourcing moral responsibility to a higher power, this is deeply unsettling. But unsettling truths are still eternal truths. Tyson's calm, observational tone makes these realizations harder to dismiss. He doesn't thunder like an adversary. He reflects like someone puzzled by how easily humans confuse certainty with understanding. His gentle incredulity. Why would a perfect being communicate ambiguously? Why would divine morality evolve? Why would the universe look meticulously indifferent? Acts like a mirror held up to beliefs people rarely examine without emotional filters. One of the most revealing aspects of his approach is how often he emphasizes the difference between wanting something to be true and evaluating whether it is true. Christianity thrives on the former. Tyson lives in the latter. This single divergence creates an intellectual gulf wider than any theological argument. It separates the need for comforting narratives from the courage to confront reality without anesthesia. This courage is not combative, it's patient, and patience is what allows Tyson to unravel beliefs that rely on speed, quick answers, quick consolations, quick explanations. Slow thinking is kryptonite to doctrines that survive on momentum. What emerges from this contrast is a picture of Christianity that struggles not because it lacks heart, but because it lacks curiosity. Tyson represents curiosity incarnate, the willingness to be confused, the willingness to be wrong, the willingness to learn without knowing where the learning will lead. And that, more than anything else, is what makes his commentary feel so disruptive. The most interesting thing about Tyson's perspective is that he never treats Christianity as an opponent. He treats it as a story, one of many that humans have crafted to soothe themselves in the face of a universe that doesn't offer soothing automatically. This framing alone undoes a lot of the tension. When a belief system is placed among other belief systems, rather than elevated above them, its claims lose their insulation. They become part of the human attempt to understand existence rather than a privileged revelation from outside it. Stories are powerful. They organize meaning, shape identity, and offer emotional protection. But Tyson's approach highlights something subtle. Stories are not immune to evidence. When the story contradicts the observable world, the story must adjust or fade. Christianity often insists on the opposite, that the world must adjust to the story. Tyson's calm refusal to participate in that inversion is what makes his commentary feel so uncompromising. It's not aggression, it's alignment with reality. A recurring theme in his observations is the disconnect between Christian claims of divine perfection and the universe's clear indifference to human convenience. If you step outside without sunscreen, the sun will burn your skin with the same enthusiasm whether or not you attended church last Sunday. Asteroids don't check baptismal records. Volcanoes don't read scripture before erupting. The universe operates with majestic impartiality. Whenever Christians argue that Earth was tailor-made for human life, Tyson points to the uninhabitable deserts, frozen wastelands, sinking coastlines, and pandemics, and asks, with characteristic politeness, whether this is really what intentional design looks like. Some believers respond by saying that suffering and danger teach virtue. It's a clever pivot, one that shifts the conversation from design to morality. But Tyson's perspective sidesteps this move entirely. If a designer intentionally creates hazards so that the inhabitants will develop character, it starts sounding less like divine wisdom and more like an eccentric architect who builds a house with random pits and then insists the residents become more athletic by falling into them. Tyson's analysis becomes quietly devastating, precisely because he avoids melodrama. He simply examines the claims and compares them to the evidence. The universe behaves as if it runs on natural processes, not moral lessons. Cosmic rays don't deliver character development. They deliver genetic mutations. Earthquakes don't reward the faithful and punish the wicked. They exert force based on friction and geology. This neutrality is not hostile to faith. It just doesn't confirm it. What many Christians struggle with is the implication that meaning might not be a prepackaged product. People want meaning to be handed down, preferably with a seal of divine authority. Tyson suggests that meaning is something humans build through curiosity and connection. This shift from inherited meaning to constructed meaning removes the comforting safety net that Christianity provides. It also opens the door to a more honest understanding of human experience. One particularly delicate point Tyson often brings up involves the human brain. Christianity insists that consciousness is a divine gift, something breathed into dust to produce a soul. But neuroscience paints a different picture. Consciousness arises from complex neural activity, not from mystical animation. Tyson's reflections on this are subtle but firm. If you damage a part of the brain, personality changes. If you stimulate a region, sensations emerge. If you shut down neural activity, consciousness disappears. These observations are difficult to reconcile with the Christian idea of an immaterial essence unaffected by physical processes. It's not that Tyson denies mystery. He simply points out that Christian explanations aren't required to account for the mystery. The universe is mysterious on its own. Consciousness is mysterious on its own. You don't need supernatural scaffolding to appreciate complexity. In fact, adding divine explanations often distorts the very phenomenon it tries to clarify. This distortion becomes apparent in Christian ideas about purpose. Many believers insist that life is meaningful because it was designed with intention. Tyson questions this gently, not by attacking the desire for purpose, but by analyzing the logic behind the claim. If purpose must be assigned externally, then meaning becomes fragile and dependent. But if purpose can emerge internally through action, creation, and connection, then meaning becomes dynamic. It grows with the person rather than being handed down like a static script. This approach challenges a deep psychological dependency within religious thinking. If your sense of value relies on an external authority, the removal of that authority feels like annihilation. But Tyson doesn't remove anything. He simply reveals that the authority was never needed for value to exist. Humans are perfectly capable of creating their own significance without appealing to cosmic supervision. There is also the issue of exclusivity. Christianity claims to possess the ultimate truth, and many denominations teach that salvation is impossible without accepting specific doctrines. Tyson finds this intellectually incompatible with the observational reality of the universe. Why would a creator scatter billions of galaxies across unimaginable distances only to hinge eternal fate on the beliefs of a species confined to one planet that existed for a cosmic blink of an eye? This is not ridicule, it's scale. The universe, when examined without narrative bias, is simply too vast for tribal metaphysics to make sense. Tyson isn't mocking faith, he's placing it in context, and context is often the enemy of absolutism. His approach becomes even more compelling when addressing miracles. Christianity treats miracles as evidence of divine interaction, moments where the laws of nature momentarily bend to accommodate a message. Tyson's view is more grounded. If a phenomenon contradicts the laws of nature, the logical response is to investigate, not to assume supernatural intervention. Human perception is notoriously unreliable. Memory is malleable. Stories evolve. The more you understand about cognitive bias, the less miraculous most miracles appear. This isn't cynicism, it's humility. Tyson trusts the universe more than anecdotes. He trusts repeatability more than stories passed down through generations of translation and reinterpretation. The burden of proof doesn't disappear because a story is old or cherished. Another fascinating element is Tyson's refusal to pretend that religious comfort outweighs intellectual integrity. Some argue that faith provides hope, structure, and resilience. Tyson doesn't dismiss these benefits, but he refuses to grant them epistemic privilege. A belief can be comforting and incorrect. A narrative can be meaningful and unsupported. Christianity often demands that comfort be treated as evidence. Tyson politely declines. His refusal highlights a crucial point. Emotional satisfaction is not a reliable indicator of truth. Humans find comfort in all kinds of illusions. The question is not whether an idea feels good, but whether it holds up when examined. Tyson's commitment to that standard exposes the underlying fragility of doctrines that rely more on reassurance than reality. Perhaps the most striking insight in Tyson's commentary is his suggestion, again implied rather than shouted, that humans might be mature enough to accept a universe without divine supervision. Christianity teaches that guidance comes from above. Tyson suggests that guidance might come from within, from curiosity, from empathy, from the shared human pursuit of understanding. It's not rebellion, it's evolution, and evolution doesn't ask for permission. There's a specific discomfort that settles in when Tyson highlights the historical evolution of Christianity, not the spiritual story, but the practical machinery behind it. He often mentions, almost casually, that religious doctrines shifted over centuries as new interpretations emerged, cultures changed, and political pressures mounted. This isn't a hostile observation, it's simply history, but it raises an uncomfortable implication. If eternal truth is subject to human revision, how eternal was it to begin with? Christianity likes to imagine its doctrines as fixed points, immovable and absolute. Yet the timeline tells a different story. Entire theological positions on salvation, morality, cosmology, even the nature of the divine, have been debated, revised, and occasionally discarded. Tyson's quiet, matter-of-fact tone acts like a mirror. It reflects the processes that believers often prefer not to notice. When truth depends on councils, votes, schisms, and reinterpretations, the divine veneer starts to look suspiciously like varnish applied by human hands. This isn't to dismiss the emotional power of the religion. Tyson is far too grounded for that. He simply refuses to mistake emotional resonance for cosmic accuracy. Humans create stories to navigate existence. Those stories adapt because humans adapt. Evolution doesn't stop at biology. It shapes culture, ethics, and belief as well. Christianity evolved because humans evolved. Tyson's perspective places the religion back into the natural flow of human development, development, instead of treating it as a perfect object dropped into history from above. This repositioning is what many find threatening. If Christianity is a human creation rather than a divine transmission, then its authority becomes negotiable. Its claims become interpretive rather than absolute. Its texts become literature rather than law. Tyson doesn't shout this. He allows the implications to form naturally in the mind of the listener, which is always more powerful than overt confrontation. One of the more intriguing aspects of Tyson's commentary is the way he approaches moral questions. Christianity often insists that morality comes from God, that without divine command, right and wrong collapse into subjectivity. Tyson disagrees gently but firmly by pointing out that moral progress throughout history rarely coincided with deeper religious devotion. In fact, moral advancements, abolition, civil rights, women's autonomy, protections for marginalized groups typically emerge through secular reasoning, protest, and philosophical debate, often opposed by religious authorities at the time. This isn't an attack, it's chronology. When Christians claim moral high ground, they often ignore the inconvenient chapter headings in their own history books. Tyson doesn't weaponize these facts. He simply observes that morality seems to flourish most when humans rely on empathy and reason rather than scripture. Morality improves not through revelation, but through reflection. A divine command system tends to freeze ethics in the mindset of the era that produced it. Tyson's worldview encourages a dynamic, evolving morality, one that grows as our understanding grows. He sees ethics not as a list handed down, but as a living process shaped by our expanding appreciation of human experience. This approach terrifies some believers because it removes the safeguard of external approval. Without a cosmic judge validating your choices, you must do the difficult work of judging yourself. Tyson's psychological insight, though understated, touches on something Christians often avoid: the desire for moral outsourcing. If rules come from above, then responsibility shifts upward as well. You just obey, you follow, you defer. But once you understand morality as a human invention, crafted through collective trial and error, you must accept responsibility for your own actions and their consequences. There is no moral autopilot. This shift is not comfortable, but it is honest. Another subject Tyson treats with characteristic precision is prayer. Not the emotional comfort of prayer, that's not something he dismisses, but its effectiveness when tested against the observable world. He notes with almost scientific politeness that outcomes for prayed-for events do not differ in any measurable way from outcomes for events not prayed for. This observation is often met with theological gymnastics. God answered in a different way, or God's plan is hidden, or the test was flawed because you can't test the divine. Yet every one of these explanations has something in common. They protect the claim from falsifiability. Tyson avoids accusing anyone of intellectual dishonesty. He simply points out that if a belief can be confirmed by any outcome, success or failure, presence or absence, then it's no longer a belief grounded in observation, but a belief insulated from it. He never mocks prayer as a psychological practice. Humans find comfort in ritual, repetition, and emotional expression. But comfort is not evidence, and Tyson refuses to confuse the two. When Christians insist that prayer changes the world, he quietly shows that prayer changes the person praying, not the external events. This distinction is subtle but devastating. If prayer's power lies only in the psychology of the believer, then the cosmological claims surrounding it collapse. Christianity's reliance on divine intervention becomes even more strained when held against modern knowledge. Diseases that were once considered punishments are now understood through virology, genetics, and epidemiology. Natural disasters once attributed to divine anger are now mapped, predicted, and explained by plate tectonics and meteorology. The more we understand, the fewer gaps remain for divine action to hide inside. Tyson doesn't celebrate this shrinkage. He simply recognizes it. He treats knowledge as expansion, not as a threat. But Christianity often treats knowledge as competition. The more humans understand, the less room there is for supernatural explanations. And so the religion leans increasingly on metaphor, mystery, and emotional resonance. Tyson leans on evidence. The divergence becomes clearest when discussing meaning. Christianity insists that meaning originates from divine intention. Tyson counters with an idea that some find liberating and others find horrifying. Meaning emerges from consciousness interacting with the world. The universe does not provide meaning automatically. Meaning is woven, not received. It grows as we grow, adapts as we adapt, and reflects our choices rather than our obedience. Some Christians find this terrifying because it removes the safety net of cosmic validation. Without divine intention, life becomes a blank canvas rather than a scripted path. Tyson sees this blankness as opportunity. Christianity often sees it as chaos, but chaos is simply order we haven't understood yet, and Tyson's worldview thrives on that challenge. One of the most subtly subversive aspects of his commentary is his refusal to pretend that humans need supervision. Christianity assumes a fragile humanity, creatures prone to sin, error, and self-destruction unless guided by divine authority. Tyson assumes a humanity capable of growth, learning, and transformation without supernatural intervention. His faith, if the word can be used in a poetic sense, is not in a deity, but in human potential. This confidence in human capacity challenges the psychological core of religious dependence. If humans can understand the universe without divine guidance, and build morality without divine command, and create meaning without divine intention, then the role Christianity assigns God becomes more symbolic than literal. Tyson doesn't attack the symbol. He just reminds people that symbols are not substitutes for reality. The cumulative effect of his perspective is not that Christianity becomes evil or absurd. It becomes unnecessary, and unnecessary beliefs are always the most fragile. Everything Tyson represents, curiosity, humility, inquiry, evidence, stands in quiet opposition to systems built on inherited certainty. Christianity can tolerate doubt, only as long as doubt doesn't win. Tyson doesn't seek victory, he seeks understanding. And understanding is the one thing belief systems cannot domesticate. One of the most telling aspects of Tyson's worldview is the way he handles the idea of cosmic justice. Christianity often leans heavily on the promise that the universe will eventually right its wrongs, that suffering will be compensated, that evil will be punished, that every tear will be accounted for. It's a reassuring narrative, especially when the world feels unbearably unfair. But Tyson approaches justice not as a cosmic guarantee, but as a human responsibility. He doesn't reject the desire for fairness. He rejects the idea that fairness is woven into the fabric of reality. This difference creates a subtle but profound divide. Christianity teaches that justice is ultimately in divine hands, even when it appears absent. Tyson suggests that justice is in human hands precisely because it appears absent. The universe has no mechanism for moral bookkeeping. It doesn't punish cruelty or reward compassion. Stars don't collapse based on ethical behavior. Galaxies don't swirl according to virtue. Morality is a human invention, born from human experience, not a cosmic imperative etched into stardust. For some believers, this idea feels bleak, but Tyson frames it differently. If justice doesn't exist automatically, then we are free to build it, to shape it, define it, improve it. The absence of cosmic justice isn't a void, it's space. Christianity fills that space with divine promise. Tyson fills it with human possibility. This shift in agency poses a challenge to religious thinking. When you stop expecting a heavenly referee to settle the score, responsibility becomes immediate and personal. The moral weight shifts downward, from the celestial to the tangible. Every act matters because there is no external ledger balancing things out. Christianity often softens this responsibility by placing ultimate judgment outside human reach. But Tyson's perspective leaves the world in our hands, which makes the stakes higher, not lower. Another quietly devastating angle Tyson introduces involves the scale of suffering. Consider the millions of years of life on Earth before humans existed. Creatures living, dying, devouring, competing, struggling. Christianity insists that suffering entered the world through a particular human event, the moral failure of the first people. But the fossil record tells a different story, one written in tooth marks, broken bones, and evolutionary dead ends. Tyson doesn't need to dramatize this. He simply points out that pain existed long before the theological explanation for its existence. Predators hunted long before scripture. Parasites thrived long before sin. To insist that suffering entered the world through human wrongdoing requires ignoring the entire biological history of the planet. This conflict isn't emotional, it's empirical, and empirical conflicts rarely favor theological narratives. Christians often respond to this dilemma by reframing suffering as instructional, a divine tool for shaping souls. Tyson dismantles this idea by drawing attention to the vast amounts of suffering that serve no lesson, teach no moral insight, and touch no human observer. A fawn burning in a forest fire doesn't become wiser. A whale tangled in nets doesn't attain spiritual refinement. Most suffering on earth is indifferent, directionless, and abundant. To insist that suffering is part of a moral plan requires overlooking the overwhelming evidence that suffering is simply a byproduct of biological and environmental systems with no intention behind them. This observation doesn't trivialize pain, it humanizes it. It frees suffering from being interpreted as punishment, trial, or message. Tyson allows suffering to be what it is, real, painful, often senseless, and reminds us that the lack of cosmic intention does not diminish the urgency of compassion. Christianity often frames compassion as obedience. Tyson frames it as humanity. This contrast exposes something deeper. Christianity depends heavily on narrative coherence. Every event must fit within a meaningful story. But stories are not structures of the universe. They are structures of the mind. Tyson understands this. He treats narrative not as the default mode of reality, but as a psychological tool humans use to navigate uncertainty. Christianity presents its story as literal truth. Tyson treats stories as metaphors at best, distractions at worst. This disconnect becomes especially pronounced when discussing divine love. Christianity claims that the universe is built on intentional love for humanity. Tyson finds this incompatible with the scale and behavior of the cosmos. The observable universe is spectacular, but it is not gentle. Radiation, black holes, supernovae, cosmic collisions, these forces are majestic but indifferent. To frame such forces as expressions of love requires redefining love into something unrecognizable. Tyson's perspective reveals the tension. Faith encourages people to reinterpret cruelty as mystery. Science encourages people to understand cruelty as natural processes devoid of intention. Christianity offers comfort by reframing reality. Tyson offers clarity by refusing to reframe it at all, yet clarity is often interpreted as coldness. Christians sometimes accuse Tyson of stripping the world of magic or wonder. But here's the irony. Tyson is arguably more enchanted by the universe than the people who claim it was made for them. When he talks about the cosmos, the birth of stars, the formation of elements, the interconnected dance of physics and time, his voice carries awe, not cynicism. His wonder is grounded in what is, not in what he wishes would be. Christianity's wonder often depends on embellishment. Tyson's depends on observation. This difference exposes a fundamental psychological divide. Christianity comforts uncertainty with certainty. Tyson comforts uncertainty with curiosity. One approach offers stability, the other offers growth. Stability feels safer, but growth leads somewhere. Tyson's worldview does not fear the unknown. It embraces it. The unknown is not a threat, it's a frontier. Perhaps the most psychologically revealing element of Tyson's commentary is his attitude toward death. Christianity promises eternal life, divine reunion, and cosmic justice. Tyson promises nothing, yet his approach is not nihilistic. Instead, he treats mortality as a catalyst for appreciation. The finite nature of existence intensifies its beauty. If life is temporary, then every choice becomes meaningful. Christianity often frames mortality as a problem to be solved. Tyson frames it as a condition to be understood. This perspective challenges one of the most powerful psychological drivers of religious belief, the desire for permanence. Humans fear endings. Christianity promises that endings are illusions. Tyson gently suggests that endings give life shape, that the transience of existence is not a flaw, but an essential feature. This reframing subtly undermines the emotional foundation that keeps many people anchored to religious belief, not because Christian teachings about the afterlife are cruel, but because they replace the depth of lived experience with the promise of something better later. Tyson is uninterested in later. He is relentlessly attentive to now. The universe is happening here. Understanding is happening here. Meaning is happening here. Christianity often locates meaning in a distant realm. Tyson insists that meaning belongs to the world we can observe, touch, explore, and question. This insistence is quietly revolutionary. It reveals that the real conflict between Tyson's worldview and Christianity is not about facts, science, or cosmology. It's about sovereignty. Who holds authority over meaning, ancient texts or living minds? Who shapes morality, divine command, or human empathy? Who determines purpose, external intention, or internal creation? Tyson doesn't force an answer. He simply removes the illusion that the answer was predetermined. And once that illusion fades, even quietly, it becomes almost impossible to restore. What makes Tyson's perspective so quietly subversive is that he never demands anyone abandon their beliefs. He simply shows, with almost surgical patience, that beliefs are not insulated from the world. If a worldview claims to describe reality, then it must eventually face reality on reality's terms. Christianity frequently avoids that confrontation by redefining the terms themselves, transforming contradictions into metaphors, turning failed prophecies into poetic interpretations, reshaping historical claims into symbolic messages when literal meaning becomes indefensible. Tyson does none of that bending. He allows the world to speak in its own voice. He trusts the universe to tell its story, without the need for theological editing. And that trust becomes a kind of philosophical honesty. When there is a gap in understanding, he leaves it open. When there is uncertainty, he acknowledges it. That level of intellectual humility stands in stark contrast to doctrines that claim to possess answers for questions humanity hadn't even formulated when those doctrines were written. One of the more profound implications of Tyson's approach is the reorientation of authority. Christianity teaches that authority flows from the top down, divine, immutable, unquestionable. Tyson's worldview reverses the direction. Authority comes from below, from evidence, from reason, from observation. No claim stands above scrutiny. No belief is too sacred to be examined. The universe itself becomes the ultimate reference point, not a book, not a tradition, not an institution. This shift reveals something essential about religious psychology. Many people don't simply want answers. They want permission. Permission to feel safe, to feel guided, to feel watched over. Christianity grants that permission generously. Tyson doesn't invalidate the desire. He simply refuses to outsource human agency to unseen forces. He suggests that perhaps we don't need cosmic permission to be thoughtful, curious, compassionate, or courageous. Perhaps those capacities already belong to us. This idea, while gentle, undermines a central pillar of religious dependence. If humans can navigate existence without divine instructions, then the entire structure of spiritual authority becomes optional, rather than essential. And once something becomes optional, it must justify itself through coherence and usefulness rather than tradition and fear. Tyson's worldview demands that beliefs earn their place rather than inherit it. Another subtle but powerful insight he introduces is the distinction between awe and submission. Christianity often treats awe as a form of worship, a response to the grandeur of creation that reinforces divine authority. Tyson treats awe as a natural reaction to scale, complexity, and mystery. It requires no hierarchy, no obedience, no metaphysical debt. Awe does not imply surrender. It implies expansion. When Tyson marvels at a nebula or a pulsar, he isn't bowing, he's learning. His wonder does not require a throne. This distinction exposes a hidden assumption in religious thinking, that awe is incomplete without devotion. Tyson proves otherwise. Awe can be free, self-contained, creative. It can drive inquiry rather than obedience. It can inspire without subordinating. Christianity often frames the universe as a message. Tyson frames it as a masterpiece, one that doesn't need a signature to be appreciated. This reframing becomes even more potent when you consider the concept of human significance. Christianity promises importance, delivers it even. It tells people they are central to the narrative, that they are cared for, watched, and destined. Tyson complicates this comfort. He shows that the universe is vast and impersonal, not because we lack value, but because value is not measured in cosmic attention. To him, significance is not a cosmic privilege, it's a human creation. We are meaningful because we decide to be, not because the universe assigns us a role. This idea is both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it places agency in human hands. Terrifying because it removes the safety net of divine direction. Christianity often teaches that meaning without divine intention is hollow. Tyson suggests the opposite, that meaning created through our own choices may be more authentic precisely because it isn't pre-written. A story you write yourself carries a different kind of weight than a story written for you. Tyson's worldview also reshapes how we relate to the past. Christianity anchors itself in ancient revelations, insisting that wisdom flows backward rather than forward. Tyson sees knowledge as cumulative. The present understands more than the past, not out of arrogance, but because that's how learning works. To elevate ancient texts above modern understanding is, from his perspective, a rejection of the very process that allowed humanity to survive and progress. This doesn't diminish the cultural or literary value of religious stories. It simply reframes them as early attempts to make sense of the world rather than final answers. Tyson treats the past with respect, but not with obedience. He honors the human impulse to explain existence while acknowledging that early explanations were inevitably limited. Christianity often canonizes those limitations. Tyson outgrows them. A particularly compelling element of his critique lies in the distinction between comfort and clarity. Christianity excels at the former. Tyson pursues the latter, and this creates an unavoidable tension. Comfort is immediate. Clarity is earned. Comfort offers closure. Clarity invites more questions. Comfort can be maintained with repetition. Clarity requires revision. One reinforces the familiar, the other disrupts it. This disruption is not malicious, it's enlightening, but enlightenment is rarely comfortable at first glance. Tyson's worldview asks people to let go of narratives that feel safe, not because safety is bad, but because safety built on illusion is unstable. Christianity asks people to hold tighter. Tyson asks them to look closer, and looking closer is often the beginning of intellectual liberation. The liberation becomes evident in the way Tyson talks about the future. Christianity often frames the future in terms of divine resolution, an ending already written, a conclusion guaranteed. Tyson rejects predetermined endings. The future is open, unpredictable, shaped by human actions and cosmic forces that indifference does not diminish. The universe is not a story moving toward a moral climax. It's an ongoing process unfolding through natural laws. This openness removes the illusion of destiny, but it replaces it with something more grounded: responsibility. If the future is unwritten, then what we do matters. If no divine intervention will solve our problems, then we must solve them ourselves. Tyson's worldview transforms passivity into participation. Christianity often encourages obedience. Tyson encourages agency. This is perhaps the quiet revolution at the heart of his commentary. He returns the universe to itself and humans to themselves. He removes the imagined supervision and watches what happens. And what happens is striking. Humans become more accountable, more curious, more creative. They stop waiting for external validation. They stop deferring to invisible authority. They start owning their existence instead of borrowing purpose from ancient texts. There's no cruelty in this perspective, only honesty. And honesty, when applied consistently, reveals something Christianity rarely admits. The religion depends on psychological needs more than empirical truth. It thrives on fear of uncertainty, fear of mortality, fear of meaninglessness. Tyson doesn't exploit those fears. He dissolves them by refusing to treat them as cosmic design flaws. They are simply parts of being human, not signs of moral failure. By removing supernatural explanations, he doesn't diminish the human story. He enriches it. The idea that our minds, our questions, our creativity arose from the natural unfolding of the cosmos is not belittling. It is extraordinary. It means we are the universe becoming aware of itself, not because a deity ordained it, but because atoms, over billions of years, discovered the capacity to wonder. Christianity wants humans to feel chosen. Tyson wants humans to feel curious. Curiosity, unlike chosenness, doesn't require special status. It requires openness. It requires humility. It requires courage. And in that courage lies the deepest challenge to religious certainty, not destruction, transformation. Tyson never insists that people abandon their stories. He simply asks whether the stories are holding them back from seeing what is undeniably in front of them. He invites people to step outside the inherited narrative and look up, not for guidance, but for understanding, not for salvation, but for perspective, not for a message, but for truth. And once someone experiences that shift, not just intellectually, but emotionally, the grip of doctrines built on fear and authority begins to loosen, gently, quietly, inevitably. Because the moment you stop demanding that the universe revolve around your story, you begin to see a far richer story unfolding, one that doesn't need divine authorship to be beautiful, a story that was here long before religion, a story that will continue long after it, a story written in light, gravity, time, and the astonishing capacity of the human mind to question itself. And that, more than anything Tyson ever says explicitly, is the brutal truth about Christianity. The universe doesn't confirm its claims, and the human mind no longer needs them. Where are you listening from? What time is it there? And what's your take on all this? Share your thoughts if you feel like joining the conversation.